Well, it's most.
I asked her.
In fact, after 3 years, I came up with a new book. They're naturalized.
Yeah, I know.
But of those, 2 not as strong as the other two.
No, it's the
It's down to
Well, Amanda said that his name was on the list, so.
Well, I'll ask when he's diet.
I reached out here.
Hello.
My NHS first moved out at the same time. That's right. And Benson Coaching was the principal of LA.
Hey.
High. And I
Welcome everyone, good evening. If you're still outside and joining us for our Shavuot program, we invite you to take your seats. Come on in. Yes, time to have a holiday.
I did. I sang for this band for 2 years. It's been a while. Each but once.
Thank you for having us.
No, he's my boss. He runs everything. All right, welcome. Take your seats, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. We're going to begin our program with our Ma'ariv for Shavuot. It's our evening service for the Chag. We invite you to open up your red Sidur Lev Shalem. You can find them in front of you, unless you're in the first row. We have the seats beside you. And the evening service is going to begin on page 39A. There's really no warm-up for a festival evening service. We jump right into it with the call to worship, so I invite everyone to please rise. Once again, page 39A, we rise for Baruch Hu. Baruch Hu et Adonai HaMevorach, Baruch Adonai Mevorach leolam va'ed. You may be seated. Baruch Adonai Mevorach. ומעביר יום ובין לילה, מבטיר בין יום ובין לילה, אדוני צבאות שמו, אל חי וקיים תמיד ימלוך עלינו לעולם ועד, ברוך אתה אדוני, המריב הרבים. Page אהבת עולם בית ישראל עמך, אהבת תורת מצוות. ואהבתך אל תסיר ממנו לעולמים, ברוך אתה אדוני, אוהב עמו ישראל. Page 41, we join together in the Shema. Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. ואהבת את אדוני אלוהיך בכל לבבך ובכל נפשך ובכל מאודיך, והיו הדברים האלה אשר אנוכי מצווך היום על לבביך, ושיננתם לבניך ודיברת בם בשבתך בביתך ובלכתך בדרך ובשוכבך וקומך, וקשרתם לאות על ידיך, והיו לטוטפות בין עיניך, וכתבתם על מזוזות ביתך ובשעריך. We continue on page 42. והיה עם שמו עד ישמעו את השם. למען תזכרו ועשיתם את כל מצוותיי והייתם קדושים לאלוהיכם, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אשר הוצאתי אתכם מארץ מצרים להיות לכם לאלוהים, אני אדוני אלוהיכם, אדוני אלוהיכם אמת. אמת בנו הכל זו וקיים אלינו. Page 43. Top of 44. ומלכותו ברצון קיבלו עליהם, משה ומרים ובני ישראל הכנו שירה בשמחה רבה ואמרו כולם, מי כמוך באלים אדוני, מי כמוך נדר בקודש, נורא תהילות הוסף אלה, מלכותך רוב ונכבו קיים לפני משה, זני ענו ואמרו, אדוני ימלוך לעולם לעד. ונאמר כברת יעקב וגלום יד חזק, ממנו ברוך אתה, אדוני גל ישראל. Page 45. השכיבנו אדוני אלוהינו לשלום במדינות. ושמור צאתנו ובואנו לחיים ולשלום, מעתה ועד עולם, ופרוס עלינו סוכת שלומך. ברוך אתה, אדוני, הפורש סוכת שלום עלינו ועל כל עמו ישראל, ועל ירושלים. We rise, page 46, on the second paragraph, the declaration for Yom Tov. וידבר משה את מועדי אדוני אל בני ישראל. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, ויאמר יברך חירותי וימליך מלכותי בחייכון ובמכון ובחייך בית ישראל, בגלה בזמן קריב ומרו. אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעולם ולעולמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא, ויתהדר ויתענה ויתעלה שמי לקודשה. בריחוני מקום בחטא ושירתה, תשחתה נחמתה דמירן מעלמה, וימרו. Amen. We turn all the way ahead to our Yom Tov Amidah, page 306. Once again, page 306, the Amidah for Ma'ariv is recited privately, quietly, and we had all the insertions for Shavuot. If you have finished praying your Amidah, you may be seated. Just for a brief second, we turn back to Kaddish Shalem, page 54. יתגדל ויתקדש שמי רבה, בעלמא דברך חירותי ומלכותי בחייכון ובמכון ובחייך בית ישראל, בגלה בזמן קריב וימרו. אמן. יהי שמי רבה מברך לעלם ולעלמי עלמיה. יתברך וישתבח ויתפאר ויתרומם ויתנשא ויתהדר ויתעלה ויתלש מלך קודשה בריחו לעילא מן כל ברכתיו שירתה תושבחתיו רחמתה דמירם בימה והימרו אמן תתקבל צלותו למען כל ישראל קודם אבונו וישמע והימרו אמן יהי שלמה רבה מן שמיא וחיים עלינו ועל כל ישראל והימרו אמן עושה שלום במרומיו הוא יעשה שלום עלינו ועל כל ישראל והימרו Amen. We rise for Aleinu, page 56. Aleinu leshabeach la'adon hakol, lateit gedula leotze breshit, shelo asanu kegoyei ha'aratzot, velo samanu kemishbechot ha'adama, shelo sam chelkeinu kahem, vegor aleinu kechol hamonam, ואנחנו קוראים ומשתחווים ומודים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים הקדוש ברוך הוא. שאלות יש שם מהמסרות? הכתוב בתורתך, ארוני ימלוך לעולם ועד, ונאמר, והיה אדוני למלך על כל הארץ. ביום ההוא יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו אחד.
The congregation mourns with the Shanasa and Hekmat families on the passing of Maluk Shanasa, aged 101, laid to rest earlier today. It's now the 6th day of Sivan, and we remember with love and devotion the art sites of Saharam Banafshian, Shirley Esther Cummings, Sasha Feldman, Arthur M. Greenwald, Jorge Kapelushnik, Doris Labelson, Herman and Antonia G. Landau and family, Louis Lawson, Isaac Meshnick, Julia Rosenbaum, Akiva Rosenbaum, and Belle Rubenstein on our continuing list. Isabel Sofer, Robert M. Barron, Mark Elliott Becker, Mahin Shadgu, Nasser Balafra, Aaron Atias, Gary Winnick, Edith Maneker, Hector Stanislavski, Craig Lawrence Smith, Cyrus Ramsey, Dr. Mike Bromberg, Iris Goodman, Musa Karazi, Sarah Nikuk, Ibrahim Golcha, Maluk Nazarian, Gertrude Weintraub, Yerachmiel Tashriva, Rebecca Daniel, Por Mahi Rastagar, Dina Brodsky, Parvin Kalati Masjedi, Shahin Faranik, Bandok Bechrad, Isabel Tubi, Corinne Arlene Turetsky, Lily Nason, Shahin Dardash, Disina Silverman, Safted, Sophia Gavish, Dr. Benjamin Haruni, Victoria of Torpati, Matisia Teherani, Farangish Shanasa, Sharam Kashani Roch, Jamila Hanani, Yosef Sheyestafar, Catherine Mirage, Lokman Danishgar, Parvin Kabud, Tanya Yadigar, Amir Kabai, Dr. Nasser Baradaran, Stanley Franklin writer, Mina Sadik, Poor Peppy Zimmerman, Joan Pelton, Alex Gold, Robert Lieb, Raquel Mansbach, Lillian Wellens, Harold Lurie, Darren Greenlee, Bijou Sadiq, Mozafar Taharani, Arnold Kessler, Parveen Gafnit Yashar, and Muluk Shanasa. Anybody else with a yard site for tomorrow morning that I might have omitted? If you're saying Kaddish, please, I think it's 58. Please rise. Yit Kadal, V'yit Kadash, Shemei Rabbah. Be'alamad divarach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei. Be'chayechon uv'yomechon. Uv'chayei dechol beit Yisrael. Ba'agala uv'izman kariv v'imru amen. Yehi shemei Rabbah mevarach le'alam lo me'omaya. Yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yit pa'ar v'yit ramam v'yit naseh v'yit hadar v'yit alev v'yit halal. Shemei dekudisha b'richu le'ela min kol brechata v'shirata. Tush b'chata v'nechemata da'amiran ba'alama v'imru. Amen. Yehi shalama rabba min shmaya v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav. Hu ya'aseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru. Amen. Moreno. Oh, I'll do it. Page 62, please. Can't walk away. 62. Yigdal Elohim Chai v'yishtabach nimtza v'yenet el mitziuto echad v'ein yachid k'yichudo ne'lam v'gam ein sof le'achduto ein lo demut haguf ואינו גוף לא נערוך אליו קדושתו, קדמון לכל דבר אשר נברא, ראשון ואין ראשית לראשיתו. הינו אדון עולם וכל נוצר, יורק גדולתו מלכותו, שפע נבואתו נתנו אל אנשי סגולתו ותפארתו. לא קם בישראל כמו שעוד נביא ומביט את תמונתו, תורת אמת נתן לעמו אל, על יד נביאו נאמן ביתו. לא יחליף האל ולא ימיר דתו, לעולמים לזולתו. סופר ויודע סתרנו, מביט לסוף דבר בקדמתו. גומל לאיש חסד כמפעלו, נותן לרשע רע כרישתו. ישלח לקץ ימין משיחנו, לפדות מחכה קץ ישועתו. מתים יחייאל ברוב חסדו, ברוך עדי עד שם תהילתו. מתים יחייאל ברוב חסדו, ברוך עדי עד שם תהילתו. ברוך תהיה. חג שמח.
Chag Sameach, everyone. It's hard to believe that it's Shavuot, as last night we counted number 49. It was like yesterday that it was number 1. This year, we're honored, before I read just in a bio, something more than a bio. When you read somebody's words in a book and you're touched, it's very different than actually hearing them from their actually own mouth and heart. And so I know for many of us clergy members who have read so many of your books and teachings over the year, it's really a pleasure that you are physically present here to engage in Torah with us. And that, of course, is Rabbi Elie Kaplan Spitz, as spiritual leader of Congregation B'nai Israel of Tustin, just right down the road, for 33 years, and also a member of the Rabbinical Assembly's Committee of Jewish Law and Standards for 20 years. If you don't know what that is, it's actually important, because what happens in the Committee of Jewish Law and Standards affects what happens in conservative synagogues around the country and world. That's where they make halachic decisions that allow the rabbis of the communities to be the Marad Atras, the ruling authorities that allow or base our decisions based on the Rabbinical Assembly's Committee of Jewish Law and Standards. So much of how we practice conservative Judaism happens at those tables over the many, many years. So thank you for that as well. Also, Rabbi Spitz has been a professor and teacher at the Ziegler School of Rabbinic Studies, which of course we are so close with an American Jewish University. Also has taught at Chapman University. One book that I always know that's on my shelf, that I have both given to so many people and used your wisdom, is an amazing book. If you have not read it yet, definitely get a copy of it. Does the Soul Survive? Jewish Views of the Afterlife, Past Lives, and Living with Purpose. So many people come to rabbis asking.
And here at Sinai, I got to hear Yigal Yadin speak, which was a great moment for me in terms of this important Israeli general archaeologist. And Sinai, in so many ways, is indeed an inspiration to rabbis around the country, and for us who live nearby, a great resource. Now, I have a connection to your rabbis as well, in that Rabbi Guzik, as you may know, grew up in Orange County. Her mom, Ellen, when she wasn't babysitting the kids on Shabbat, would sometimes come to CBI. And it was always a sense of being connected to Sinai, to look out and to see her. So I first chance to really, I'd like to spend more time with Rabbi Sherman, but I know that we have a lot in common. 1 girl and 2 sons in terms of children, which is my wife Linda and our children ratio, and that our son also did Columbia and Liz. So strong connection. And last, also to honor a new person in my life. So you have to remind me as to your name. So you're here with child, beginning a new phase in your life. I celebrate with you. I have a long history with Avi Taff. I grew up with Rabbi Tuttenauer in Phoenix, going to synagogue every Saturday with my father and sitting near Rabbi Taff's grandparents, Elaine and Jack Finkelstein. And one of my first job in a synagogue before I was in rabbinical school, was working at a summer camp with his parents in Phoenix. So a lot of connections to many of you in the room. I want to honor Jay, who was at CVI for years as well. So it's just a treat to be here. The book that I look to share with you, I did bring some extras. If anybody wants, you can take it home. You can later make an honorarium contribution. They'll forward it to me, whatever you feel is right. I don't sell on Shabbat, so you can take and later contribute. And one last thing, and then I'll start rolling with not selling. And that is in February, in honor of my wife's 38th anniversary, you can join us in Havana on a Jewish tour. They're rare to find. I have a congregant who organizes trips. She did it for B'nai B'rith for several years to Cuba. This is Jewishly oriented with $500 of the cost to help the Jews. There are 600 remaining elderly Jews in Cuba of the 2,400 who were there 20 years ago when she started doing these trips. So in sum, I bring things to you of that kind, and now I hope to bring to you some Torah in honor of Shavuot. And that's to teach, and I welcome those who are doing this remotely as well, and wish all of us a celebration of receiving Torah. So Duets on Psalms is my more recent book, about 6 months ago, and a little bit about how it came to be, and I'll pace myself to say that I look to speak for about 25 or 30 minutes, and then a conversation for 25 or 30 minutes. During COVID, we all remember that, not so long ago, I began to teach all 150 Psalms for a half hour each, 3 Psalms a week by Zoom. And with Zoom, I had students all over the country, even a student in England. And I had never deeply learned Psalms before. As a rabbi, I chanted Psalms in every prayer service. We chant some, but I had never taken the time to learn them in depth, and I had a need to do so. And so I was teaching these Psalms, not knowing how long COVID would last, how far I would get. Bottom line, I completed all 150 in the course, and you can go online. You can either go to YouTube and just put in Psalm a Day, Elie Spitz. You'll get all 150. You can pick them, or I have a website, eliespitz.com, if you want to see those recordings and study Psalms. And what I found in learning these Psalms and having that luxury of time to do lots and lots of research is that they were so purposefully, artistically woven. Many of us know Psalms, and that's one reason I chose to teach Psalm 23 tonight in part, because that's the best known of the Psalms. Rabbi Harold Kushner wrote an entire book called The Lord is My Shepherd. Every chapter is one verse of that psalm, which is to say, he chose it. He once shared with me, this was the one book that he wrote that his publisher came and said, we want you to write this book. It was after September 11th and felt it would be comforting to people, which prompted it. So we'll look at Psalm 23. While I was teaching on Zoom, I had this dear mentor, and I hesitate to call him a friend because Rabbi Jack Reamer, as Rabbi Sherman shared, is old. He's 95 at the moment. And I called him yesterday, maybe this morning. I called Jack this morning. And whenever I call him, he's in Boca Raton, he'll say, let me tell you something before we go. Let me give you a little vort, a little teaching. And it's always a teaching of something he read in the last few days. He has total recall of what he's still reading. And more than that, he has the enthusiasm of a teenager, still at age 95. And he tuned in to my teachings from Boca. And when I saw Jack on the screen, it was like, oh my God, I gotta say something. I'm gonna do extra research the next class because Jack's gonna be there. And I love Jack. I don't feel pressured by him, but I have such admiration for him. And when I finished the course, he said to me, which was not unlike myself, he said, I've been teaching Torah all these years, but I've never looked at Psalms closely. And he taught 5 Psalms in Boca, and his wife, Sue, said, you and Ellie should write a book together on Psalms. You're of different generations. It would be worth hearing. So he said to Sue, I'll do it for you. So he wrote the dedication before he began to work on the book. Labtani, to my love, from Shir HaShirim. And in sum, we picked 13 Psalms that we both felt we had something to contribute. And we tried to do 2 things. One is share the artistry of the weave, the purposeful choices that the poet in these songs, our Jewish people's playlist, what choices they made and how wonderfully composed each of these psalms are. And secondly, as pulpit rabbis, to do what is distinctive to pulpit rabbis, not necessarily true for academics who we relied on in some degree for part 1, and that is, how is this meaningful to us? How does it resonate? And what might we find both meaningful and objectionable as well? And so the book Duets on Psalms emerged, and that's the context. A little bit, so what I'd like to do is talk a little bit about the trajectory and the purpose of Psalms, and then with that, look at 2 relatively short Psalms, Psalm 1 and Psalm 23, and share those 2 things with you. The artistry, the purposefulness of the weave, the ambiguity of the poetry, and how it's meaningful. So Psalm 1, both of the Psalms that I picked are 6 verses. And now I think Psalm 1. So tonight is Shavuot, the gift of Torah. The beginning of Joshua begins, which is the beginning of the prophets. Joshua is the beginning of the prophets. Psalm 1 is the beginning of Ketuvim, the latter writings. Tanakh, Torah, Nevi'im, Ketuvim. And if you look at the beginning of, which you don't have unless you grab a Chumash, Joshua chapter 1. So right after Deuteronomy, the story of Joshua continues as the people begin to enter the land. And here's how Joshua begins with verse 6. Chazak ve'amatz, be strong and resolute, for you shall apportion to this people the land that I swore to their fathers to assign to them. But you must be very strong and resolute to observe faithfully all the teachings that my servant Moses enjoined upon you. Do not deviate from it to the right or to the left, that you may be successful wherever you go. Let not the book of the teaching cease from your lips, but recite it day and night, so that you may observe faithfully all that is written in it. So point 1 is the importance of tonight and tomorrow, of Shavuot, of receiving the teaching of Moses, the teaching that God gives us to guide us on our way. That is what Joshua says as he begins his leadership. Remember the words of Moses. And you'll see, now looking at Psalm 1, that the 150 Psalms, and I'm emphasizing this in part because it's Shavuot, begins with the importance of Torah. And so here's the beginning. Happy is the person who has not walked in the counsel of the wicked, and in the way of sinners has not stood, or in the seat of the scornful has not sat. But rather, in the Torah of Adonai is their delight. Ki im b'torat Adonai chetzo, u'b'torato yegeh yomam v'layla. And in God's Torah do they meditate day and night. You hear the resonance of what Joshua said and the beginning of Psalms about meditating on Torah day and night. And they shall be, they who keep good counsel and focus on Torah. They shall be like a tree planted by streams of water, which bring forth its fruit in its season and whose leaf does not wither. In all that they do, they will succeed. Not so the wicked. Rather, they are like the chaff, kamots, that the wind drives away. Therefore, the wicked shall not stand in the judgment, and sinners in the congregation of the righteous. For Adonai knows the ways of the righteous, and the way of the wicked will perish. Torah, here we are taught, gives the person the path to live the life that will allow that person to flourish. There is an academic who wrote a paper. Wait. I actually did my homework. I wrote Rabbi Gusick. I said that I just learned that Taylor Swift, to prepare for a concert, did her entire set on a treadmill so that she would work on her stamina and she would sing her entire set. So I really worked on preparing and then left my sheet at home. But I remember, only because I was trained at Ziegler and at JTS. I say that in honor of Shoshana, who's going to JTS this next year, to do footnotes. So, and to look for what the academics have to say. So there's an academic footnote in my book, 21, Benjamin Summer, who said, in reference to Psalm 1, that the editor, he surmises, right? That's what a biblical critic, modern Bible scholar seeks to do, is try to discern when things were written and by whom. So he says that the editor of Joshua was the same editor of Psalms. And he knows that and says that this is Psalm 1 of the 150 because of its emphasis on the study of Torah, of the mind. You know, there's always this tension of mind of Moses, the teacher, and of David, the heart, the lyre, harpist, the singer to God of sweet songs, speaking from his heart. And in this case, the claim is that Moses, the teacher of Torah, is, for the editor, primary, and therefore Joshua puts that in chapter 1, and Psalms begins. And so part of my pleasure is having another point of view, which I want to share. And that is, I was a psychology major. And that means I'm always thinking, and also I was a pulpit rabbi. I said was, because I'm emeritus now for a couple of years. And that means, and I loved being a pulpit rabbi, I say it to my colleagues, it's a great privilege to ask those questions of how is this relevant to the person in front of you. That's Torah of a real kind. And therefore, as a psychology major and as a pulpit rabbi, I'm aware that there was a psychologist, Alfred Adler. He was one of the early psychoanalysts in the school of Freud in Vienna. And he said, if you want to know somebody quickly, ask him or her for their earliest memory. And what gets distilled and held onto is in some ways core for their self-identity. And applying that to text, which I've done once I heard that, what I find is that the opening line and the opening verse, even the opening word, is often pointing to where it's going. And so, happy is the person who has not walked in the counsel of the wicked, and in the way of sinners has not stood, or in the seat of the scornful has not sat. It seems to me that the reason Psalm 1 is Psalm 1, or at least the message of the trajectory of Psalms, is that what is the goal of these poems to God? It's to make us happy. I once heard the Dalai Lama, the great teacher of the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, that Nobel Peace Prize winner, say that the goal of religion is happiness. When he said that, I thought, it didn't quite sit Jewishly for me. You know, we're more angst-ridden than that. We're Yisrael, the ones who wrestle with God. So, but I thought about it more through the years and understood that lave, heart, is not just emotions. Because what bothered me about happiness is the Dalai Lama said it seemed like a fleeting emotion, superficial, not substantive enough. But I appreciated that lave, heart, is both in our tradition, in the biblical mode, feelings, but also mind. It's the whole person. And the guidance, conscience, is lave. And so happiness, ashrei, the opening word here, is about becoming a whole person, a complete person, a contented person. And how does one become content? Well, Psalms will guide us. And what is the core of Psalms? What's so dramatic about this playlist? It's a quality of honesty. It's about relationship. It's about relationship first and foremost with God. The psalmist is talking to God, and because God, you can't lie to God because God knows you, is the mindset. It's unfiltered. I do an exercise to teach prayer. In fact, I once taught it here in this chapel. And that was letters to and from God as a way to teach prayer. You write a letter to God, it's private, and then you do this act of cosmic empathy and you write back as if you're God responding to yourself. For the psalmist, these are letters to God. They are written unfiltered and at the same time, incredibly purposeful and poetic, but unfiltered. And so Psalm 1 leads us with its opening word pointing to the religious mission. And that is to begin acknowledging, remarkably, that it's the company that we keep that shapes our values and our priorities and where our focus is. And therefore, Psalm 1 comes to emphasize, put your focus on Torah. Keep the company of other people for whom that's important. And that's who we are in this room on Erev Shavuot. Because where you put your attention and the company you keep will create the momentum, that powerful force that will lead you and guide you toward a complete wholeness of life. And the trajectory of Psalms, just to say a word about it, goes from two introductory Psalms, Psalm 1 and 2, to Psalm 3, where it's already wrestling with danger. And the corpus of the Psalms are, if you will, a palette, as an artist would have a palette of emotions. Psalm 88, one that's not in our prayer books, ends with the word darkness, and it's unrelenting darkness. Psalm 44, which is in this book, says, God, why have you made us a mockery? And it's filled with anger. But always with the sense that, in this theology, that God is present, open, and we can be and need to be our most honest selves. And I sense that that's part of why Psalms endures, because it's coming from the core expression of this array of historical experiences, be it exile in Babylonia, battles in Israel with King David, to simply loneliness and the whole array that ends with hallelujah. So the last 5 Psalms, now I'm hearing Leonard Cohen, and the song is probably sung on more street corners these days by guys with open cases of guitar. Hallelujah. It ends with rejoicing, and of all of the verses and all of the words, Psalm 150 will be about musical instruments, praising God and ending with the breath. Kol neshama hallelujah, hallelujah. One closing word and then Psalm 23. And that is, many of us know segments of Psalms because they've been put to music. Most of the Psalms, apparently, from their introductions, were sung, meant to be sung, both to learn but also because the music amplifies emotion. And they were sung by the Levites when pilgrims would come on Shavuot to Jerusalem. And mind you, 3,000 years ago, people lived in handmade homes. Literally, they made that themselves. And they would come to those massive steps of the Temple Mount and they would climb. That was an experience of wonder and awe. And at the top was an orchestra singing psalms. And so we too tend to sing the songs. Ehesa'enai el heharim, hine matovu manayim. All of these songs, so many of our camp songs are snippets of the 150 Psalms. But the revelation for me, and why I encourage you to study the Psalms, be it with those recordings or on your own, with the book, is the Psalms themselves and the order in which they are composed and how they're woven purposefully is, for me, a revelation and breathtaking and a sense of the gift that we have, that we inherit. Shavuot is the holiday to celebrate gifts. Matan, Zman Matan Toratenu, the time of gift giving of the Torah. And that's the word used. And Matan is not just giving, but the notion that this is the holiday in which we got and continue to receive. It's in the present tense. Every time we study, we receive this gift. And it's true for Psalms. And so the most psalm that we know the most is Psalm 23. And this too was a revelation for me in studying it closely. When I taught the 150 Psalms, I did my own translations for all of them. And the reason I did my own translation is, first, I wasn't comfortable with God being a he. So I wanted to do a translation that wasn't literal in that sense, in terms of the pronouns, because that's not the God I pray to as a guy. I mean, God is God. Or I also wanted to somehow convey, which I didn't find in many of the translations, some of the ambiguity and artistry of the Hebrew and how it was woven. That's harder to do. And so Psalm 23, I want to share because we will encounter it over and over. We tend to encounter it at funerals. And the reason we encounter it at funerals is because of its opening image. It's actually a storyboard. And it's a storyboard of a variety of different images. And what I want to share with you is it's about the different phases of life. But we tend to hear this with the opening image. A Psalm of David. Adonai ro'i lo echsar. Adonai is my shepherd, I shall not lack. Binodesha yog bitseni, in great pastures, God lets me lie down. Al mei menuchot yenahaleni, alongside tranquil waters leads me. So these 6 verses can be divided into 3 sections, 2 verses each. The opening is so comforting. we are cared for by God. We are sheep. We have in the Jewish tradition many shepherds: Moses, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. And the image of a shepherd is that for a shepherd, every sheep counts. For a shepherd, there's the sense of the sheep being taken care of, guided. And so all the more at graveside, where we're feeling at a loss for our own control over that which is most profound in life, life itself. We're reminded that we are mortal, that a loved one has left in the physical presence. In that moment, only naturally we want to feel held, comforted. That's my sense of why, of all the 150 Psalms, Psalm 23 comes to hold. In the beginning, it begins to hold. But then something happens that's interesting. Verse 3 and 4 go together. Nafshi yeshovev, my spirit, my breath, yeshovev, God revives. So it's as if we are exhausted, and that too, this is the transition. And God gives us our breath back. You know, death knocks the air out of you. God is the source of breath. God breathed into Adam the breath of life. And so breath, nafshi. But then, yanchi b'maglei tzedek l'man shemo, guiding me, and you can see how I'm translating it, on roundabouts of justice for the sake of the divine name. For me, this is a transition from childhood, from being cared for, from being passive, to adulthood. Now, the most well-known translation, even in our Jewish texts, usually at graveside, is the King James Version, which says, "and leads me on straight paths." Now, there's, again, some room for that, and that's magle is path, and tzedek tirdof, righteousness you shall pursue. That's Deuteronomy. But here, tzedek is translated by King James as straight. This is related to justice, right? It's the straight and narrow path, we would say, of justice. But what I loved about this, actually, when I was teaching this in my Zoom class, I had a congregant I was very fond of who was a transportation planner. She and her husband was a transportation planner, did a lot of the roads in Israel. They were involved with the rapid transit system. They're significant players in that business. And I was telling her that ma'agal is a wheel. And that somehow straight paths, it seems to me that it's roundabouts of justice. And she said, it should be roundabouts, because when you're in a roundabout, you got all these decisions to make of which way you're going to go. And this verse is the transition into adulthood, where it's about the choices that we make. And we have the power, the ability to affect change. Power equals the ability to affect change, to choose which path we're going to take. That's back to Psalm 1 and paths. For the sake of the divine name, which means we do it not for what's good for us, but because it's the right thing to do. And ultimately, that's the moral choice that adulthood revolves around. Putting your own immediate goals, your own expediency, your own self-satisfactions aside for a higher purpose, for what is right. So that's the transition into adulthood. The sense that we're not passive. We have choices to make, and the choices have to be grounded in something greater than ourselves, to be, indeed, transcend ourselves. Also, Gam, for though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, this too is why it's linked to funerals. There is mention of the shadow of death. I will fear no harm, for you stand with me. Your restraining rod and your supporting staff, they comfort me. One of the things I found in my research and writing, I saw it in certain classical commentaries, as they sometimes point to the middle phrase of a psalm as, if you will, the bullseye. And I began to do that for every psalm. In this case, the middle of this psalm, which I put in bold, is Ki ata imadi, for you stand with me. That's the bullseye of how one can go on in life with all the dangers that surround us and do what's right and feel comforted in loss. Ki ata imadi, for you are with me. And then there's this redundancy, seemingly, of shiftecha umishantecha, a rod and a staff. And they too, as biblical commentators, as Rashi would point out, shiftecha is what you hit somebody with, and mishantecha, sha'anan, is repose. Mishantecha is a supporting staff. That here, there's a sense that when God stands with us to comfort us, it requires two things. It requires the rod and the support staff, chesed and gevura, kindness and restraint. Only together in the Jewish mystical tradition do you get compassion when you have simultaneously the flow of love and judgment coming together. You prepare, and now the next image, verse 5. You prepare a table for me opposite my tormentors. You luxuriate my head with oil, my cup overflows. There's an acknowledgement that life is dangerous. I was reminded in coming into this chapel today that there are no windows, in part because we live in a dangerous world. There was good security out front. And that's true throughout the Psalms. You know, the Psalms is not all sweet. Psalms are filled with the tensions of life and pain because life is dangerous. And the ability, which is the power for me of this verse, to be able to feel the gifts of life, to luxuriate one's head with oil, to feel that one's cup overflows, to have gratitude, and simultaneously to know that there is danger in front of us, that there are enemies around us. That too is part of adulthood, which leads to the closing image. Let only goodness, ach tov v'chesed yirdefuni, let only good and kindness pursue me, kol yemei chayai, all the days of my life. V'shafti beveit Adonai la'arich yamim, and then I will dwell in the house of the ever-present one for unending days. Now, some biblical scholars would say that this clearly refers to the temple, and likewise the head with oil is another image of the inauguration of the priest, that most of these psalms were written by priests and Levites. Those are temple images. But back to being a contemporary rabbi and personalizing this. And that's the other word opportunity. And that is the word play on V'shafti, and I will dwell, is also Shabbat. Same root.
Very interesting translation.
Yeah, that's something that I smile over only in terms of it being my own suggestion. To contemporize it, we have a sense of Shabbat for unending days, because that's the messianic hope. That the taste of Shabbat that we get once a week, that's a taste to give us hope that could continue on more than one day a week, and it can be a world at peace and harmony. And that this journey, to pull this together, is a journey that begins with vulnerability and being cared for, and transitions us to choices of adulthood, of roundabouts, of moral choices, of what God would want. And then in this adulthood, Knowing that God stands alongside of us. That's the central words. And because God stands alongside of us, we have a quality of security, even in turmoil. And that's the security that allows us to feel gratitude despite the fact that the world is always uncertain and incomplete. And last, that the trajectory of our life and the trajectory of our days is toward Shabbat. That's not just the seventh day of the week. That's a mindset of feeling at peace, of feeling whole, of feeling that we are in God's presence for unending days. And so this is but one psalm, Psalm 23. I could say a lot more about it. You can go to my, again, half-hour analysis. I think I taught it maybe 2 times, maybe an hour, because there's so many other biblical, Jewish classic commentators. Fascinating, I found, was going to Wikipedia. Wikipedia has an entry for every psalm, which will tell you what classical musical compositions were done. You know, Lincoln Center did all 150 psalms as a series about
Whose compositions?
Mostly church. Some of them, they commissioned 10, including one by Linda's cousin, David Lang. Psalm 106, I think, for that Lincoln Center thing. But which is to say, there is music, Jewish music, Christian music. Psalms are the backbone for liturgy, for the Jewish tradition, for the Christian tradition. They're the words we turn to when we want to feel comforted, when we are feeling the need to put into words the importance of the holiday of Shavuot. Psalm 119, the longest of the Psalms, 176 verses, is what was chosen in Lev Shalem. They abridged that because it's about the importance of Torah. In my own study, over these last few years, there has been this awakening to this added piece of profound gift. There's Tikkun Leil Shavuot. On the eve of Shavuot, there was a booklet put together about preparation that you study the whole night. And you're supposed to taste from all the different parts of Torah, not just the 5 books, not just the 10 Commandments, not just the 5 books, but tonight we've had a little taste of Ketuvim, of Nevi'im with Joshua, which begins with the importance of Torah, and therefore, in sum, Ketuvim, the latter writings that begin with these 150 poems, are part of our Torah, part of our legacy, part of our celebration that allows us, back to Psalm 1, to live a life that leads us toward wholeness, contentment, because it's a life that's grounded in the company we keep, the books that we read, and the values that we seek to live out. So with that, a chance for you to react and ask any questions about this psalm or other psalms.
I'm just going to grab another microphone for
Okay.
people at home. If we could speak into the microphone just so that they can hear the question, I would appreciate it.
We'll get you a mic so that our larger audience can participate.
Okay.
Tell me your name.
My name is Joseph Shalant. Can you hear me now? Check. Yeah, you have to speak. Oh, okay. I guess you can hear me now. I was looking at the Psalm 23, number 6. Only goodness and kindness pursue me all the days of my life. It's lovely to think that and to seek refuge in that concept, which is where religion gives us comfort and solace, but yet we live in a world, both outside and within our own family lives, of great distress, discomfort, death, suffering. And we see this all the time. But I see something beyond that. And looking at Israel today, after October 7th, And we see the survivors, just the Jews in general, being so involved and sympathetic with what is happening. But yet I don't hear hatred coming from them toward the Palestinians, for example. And it's like they're finding some goodness in their hearts, and they can't just exude hatred that way. And I see that perhaps the reification, the reflection in our lives of this part of the psalm in the way our people are behaving and reacting to great tragedy.
Is first name again?
Joseph.
That's what I thought. So Joseph, I'm going to repeat just to make sure that everybody heard and just react. Joseph focuses on the concluding image of seeking to be in Sabbath in the home of Adonai for unending days, and how challenging and difficult it is to feel that quality of peacefulness and goodness when there is so much hatred. And all the more in this time where Israel and Jews everywhere are under siege in so many ways. I just pause, and now I feel the air knocked out of me to know that I'm a child of Holocaust survivors. I grew up hearing stories of that darkness, that pain, that loss of family, and that today it's, my son, we have a son, we have more than one child living in New York City. He went to the Nova exhibit today in New York, our middle child, and he went today because there was a march yesterday that can only be, that was filled with such hatred for Jews. And he just felt the need in response. It was in front of this exhibit of the horrors that took place at that music festival on October 7th. So I start by going to my gut and my sense of disorientation. I'm still disoriented by now feeling how Jews in the world are feeling vulnerable. Again, I'm without words. It did not exist last Shavuot in that way. It's really October 7th since. And Joseph puts his finger on the Jewish calling to rise above the hatred. I've spent some time in Israel, much time in Israel through the years. Sadly, it's only natural as humans to respond with hate to hate. That's natural. And sadly, in Israel, there is a lot of deeply felt hatred on all sides, sadly. And that's where I turn to Psalms and say a variety of things. One, in all times, there has been fighting and war and fear and the opportunity to rise above hate. And at its best, when we are at our best, a psalm like Psalm 23 can give us pause to ask ourselves questions to gain perspective. What does it mean to be on roundabouts of justice? What are those choices? To what degree, as you would guide us, Joseph, do we as Jews need to ride above the natural human reflex of hate in response to hate? And that's where Psalms and all of our Torah come to prompt us to reflect about what it can be, back to this psalm, L'ma'an Shemo, for the sake of his name. Rabbi Harold Kushner, I mentioned, wrote a book on Psalm 23. And on L'ma'an Shemo, on that phrase, for his name, he turns to the story of Egypt and God taking the Israelites out of slavery and saying that when God liberates the Jews from slavery, he does it for God's sake. Because the message is, it's not because Pharaoh wanted it. It's because it was the way God as the creator would want freedom to be expressed in human life. And that knowing that freedom, this is again Rabbi Harold Kushner on that phrase here, is what transcends the expediency of slavery, which was justified economically, historically, as not morally right. And so back to hatred. Our challenge is to see the world through God's eyes, with all God's creatures as deserving and needing to be reacted to without a reflex response. So, Psalms, back to the Psalms as a prompt for us to be our best. Tell me again.
Fred.
Got it. Fred, I'm asking you? You gotta hold on to it. Okay, go ahead, Fred.
Rabbi, can you speak very elementary about the Psalms? Who wrote them?
Yeah.
Did David write them? So many of them begin as more le David. How
Yeah.
are they organized? How old might they be?
Yeah. So David asks the foundational question of who wrote the Psalms. We often think of them as the Psalms of David. To what degree are they as old as David? Meaning 3,000 some years ago. And here, remarkably, a few things to say. It became one of my fascinations as well. Interestingly for me, when I got to the end of the Psalms, of the 150, I then said to myself in a much more focused way, who wrote, where do they come from? And what I found is there's no consensus. There are 10 different authors by name within the corpus. King David is the main author, and about half of the Psalms are identified with him. And there's context for that, because earlier there's writing, David is, writing psalms and playing the harp in the time of King Saul. So there's something to that. But when it says le David, scholars would say it doesn't mean it was written by David. It could mean in the style of David or for David in the court. What we know is that the book was edited roughly after the first exile. So we have Psalm 137, by the rivers of Babylon. That's a long time after King David, the exile of that first period. And so classic commentators would say David wrote that with prophetic powers. He anticipated the exile. And, but we don't, what differentiates a modern reader from a pre-modern reader is that ideas have a history. And in this case, these songs were put together over hundreds of years. They were the playlist for the Levites, often written by Levites and priests and as well. But the Levites were the ones who did the music and did the singing. And therefore, you get, the sons of Korach is one of those 10s, the sons of Asaph. There's one that's written by Moses, meaning much earlier than David. So to pull this together, what we know is that these songs were alive in the first temple period, and that not all of them got put into the liturgy, meaning some were written not necessarily for public singing, but were poems of the heart, like I mentioned Psalm 88, which is darkness, profound description of despair, and others that were meant for pilgrims, communal singing, and a whole range. They are remarkable, from 2 verses to 186 verses, a lot of variety in styles. And last, for dating, some have Aramaic, meaning pointing philologically, kind of the archaeology of time, to a much later period than King David.
Is there a logic to their organization for the numbering?
There, you know, there is to some degree, there is to the editing process, meaning the editor, which we don't know who that was, clearly had a sense of putting it together. So in my introduction, I talked about Psalm 1 and 2. Psalm 1 is not to God. God's in the third person. It's about Torah. It's about the company you keep. Starting with Psalm 3, it's more direct. And the closing is singing, hallelujahs. So there's a sense of trajectory. There's some repetition. But it seemed to me, in going through all 150 very carefully, that each psalm was distinctive and purposeful in where it was placed as well. There's shifts and style. It's a big topic because, again, it's 150 different poems written over a long period of time. Not all in Israel, like that song from Babylon, though there two scholars will debate if it was written after they returned. A lot of variety.
That wouldn't be First Temple period.
What's that?
It wouldn't be First Temple period if it was written in Babylon, right?
Well, they're exiled. They go to Babylonia. So some go beyond the First Temple period, because that's after the destruction of the First Temple is by Babylonia, 586 before the Common Era. They go to Babylon and then they return within 70 years.
Right. No, but I thought you said all the Psalms were in from the First
Well,
Temple period.
correction is well taken. Not all the Psalms were necessarily First Temple. That's the corpus, but others continue to be added, like Psalm 137. Yeah. Yes. Tell me your name.
I'm Howard. I think you picked a very good companion of Psalms, because I think in some ways they're similar, in some ways different.
I missed a word.
I said I think you picked a very good companionship between these two Psalms,
Yeah.
because in some ways they're different, in some ways they're similar.
Go ahead.
So the ways that these are similar is about feelings. And in the first Psalm, Psalm 1, it's projection of happiness, but it's coming from the third person. You will be happy if you do A, B, and C. And the result of which, you're going to be like the trees planted by the streams of water. The second one, on Psalm 23, is a feeling of vulnerability. You use the word in your answer to the question. And the vulnerability is somewhat in two ways. It could be the vulnerability of the shepherd, but it could be the shepherd putting himself in the place of the sheep. And how did the sheep feel? The sheep are going to feel, we don't know, but the sheep are walking through this area where they're going to be attacked by animals all the time. And the idea that what makes them also different is that in the first person, the author is projecting himself as, you will do this, you will be this. But I think in the second one, the shepherd is projecting himself as a sheep and the vulnerability that they have. And so it's a psalm of empathy, where the first psalm is a psalm of teaching.
So Howard emphasizes the emotional dimensions of Psalm 1 and Psalm 23 and how they're complementary, where there's a sense of the vulnerability in Psalm 23, and in Psalm 1, a path to finding some security.
That's right.
So I think that's right, though I will add, with Psalm 1, there's also the first person, I shall not lack. And then I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, and you stand with me. So there's a very much a first person in Psalm 23, and in Psalm 1, it's back to the emotional dimension, it's in the third person. And that's the difference between them. Though in Psalm 23, it goes both ways. Meaning verse 3, for instance, my spirit God revives, guides me. There's a seesaw between the personal and belief. In Psalm 1, the guide, it's teaching. That's right.
What I was trying to do, though, is take this beyond the literal and project, how can I look at this in so many different ways?
Yeah.
And so to have real empathy, you have to put yourself in the other person's place.
Right.
And know how they feel. And so while the shepherd is thinking about himself, how I feel about going through this valley, it's also about how the shepherd might feel as if I was the sheep, because the sheep's also going in the same place as the shepherd. And they're subject to the same vulnerabilities. So that's the empathetic part that I wanted to bring out. That's not literal, but it's a meaning that I subscribe to.
Well, thank you, Howard. And the piece that, again, I want to emphasize, and now I have always one eye on the clock, and then Shoshana gets the left. Shoshana and
Rosa.
And Rosa. I'll harvest those, react, and pull this together. So I'm going to defer to Rosa, Shoshana, and then you'll get the last.
Well, my question to you is defending yourself is hate?
This goes back to Joseph's comment about, is that what you're referring to?
Well, yes and no. Because how can you defend yourself and still smile and love?
Right. So what I hear you sharing, Rosa, is when one is attacked, one has a need to protect oneself.
Right.
And in that moment of responding and doing so, in some cases with violence, back to war, which was where Joseph led us, it's natural to be in a place where one's emotions are not in a happy, smiling place, but in a place of focused attention and doing what one needs to do for a greater goal. So, no doubt, these psalms, like in this psalm, have many different moments and moods within it. That's what I wanted to emphasize in Psalm 23, that there are different images. It's like a storyboard. And there is a time and place for, in response to war, doing what one needs to do. Again, BBC, I don't know if you saw this interview, it still resonates because it was like yesterday, when Israel went in to get out the 4 hostages just this week. And the BBC interviewer said to the Israeli spokesperson, did you see this? Could Israel have given some notice before? And it was like, you got no words. So back to your comment, Rosa, sometimes there's a need to act, and it's painful, and you can't tap into the pain. You just got to do what you need to do. And then later you can reflect. And the goal, the ultimate goal, back to the trajectory of these Psalms. The middle of these Psalms is filled with calling out to God in despair. Over and over. There's a lot of pain and a lot of danger in life. But from the beginning to the end, as the book ends, it's let me keep the company that will allow me to be focused on my best self for your sake, God. And let my life be one on a trajectory toward contentment, despite the pain, that allows me to sing hallelujah. And my teacher, Rabbi Jack Reamer, and I will share, Rabbi Sherman, your introduction in reference to Rabbi Reamer, teaching his teacher, Rabbi Heschel. He was the secretary for Rabbi Heschel when he was at the seminary. Yeah, so that when we sing Ashrei, we are the canners of the world. If you look at it, that's another one of the essays, that we're called to sing on behalf of all aspects of the world with gratitude for the life that we have. So last Shoshana, and then I'll pull it together. You had a question?
I did. Yeah.
I had the privilege to do...
Apparently I have to use the microphone.
To do Pam's wedding. And Steve?
What?
Your husband is?
Mike, hers.
Oh, my husband is Mike.
Mike, to do Pam and Mike's wedding many years ago. So I get such a kick out of when Shoshana speaks, since I knew before there was Shoshana.
So I had a semantics question for how you translated Psalm 23.
Yeah.
Because it's Gam ki elech be'get salmavet, and you wrote, and it's typical to see, for though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, but it's actually in future tense. But then you translate lo ira ra as I will fear no harm. And I was curious if that was a purposeful translation of the present tense and then the future tense, or if it was more just taking another common translation and then adding your own.
So your question, first I'll repeat it for everybody to hear it and for me to react. And that is, the way that I translate verse 4 is Gam ki elech be'get salmavet, for though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, which is in the present tense, lo ira ra ki tamidi, I will not, I fear no harm, for you stand with me. And that goes into the future tense. So in biblical Hebrew, see, Shoshana's just getting ready to go to rabbinical school. You'll learn, which I really, in translating all the Psalms, relearned. Namely, there's only 2 tenses in biblical Hebrew, not 3.
Perfect.
So we're used to past, present, and future. In Hebrew, there is perfect and imperfect, 2 tenses. And in the imperfect, it's present and future, and you get to pick how you want to see it. And what I found fascinating, and it's another reason I translated all of the Psalms, is because I was fascinated by how translations are interpretation, both in terms of the words, straight paths versus roundabouts. That sounds very different, but also tenses. Fascinating to see the choices and why those choices are made. And so...
A lot of people would translate this as future, like...
You have that choice. You can choose it to, I will, though when I walk, or I will walk, or though I walk now. And it can go either way in terms of the Hebrew itself. Yeah. So back to pulling this together, what I learned is how I, as a rabbi, had never studied the Psalms carefully, and I frankly was, because it's not like where my interest is, was not that focused on the complexities of grammar. There's other pieces. There's jussive and reflexive that are often in the future tense in Hebrew. So that Hebrew as a language and grammar is constructed differently than our English. And for me, the exercise of translating these Psalms was becoming much more attuned to both the possibilities of the poetry, where both could simultaneously be true. Because that's the nature of a poem. A poem is often saying 2 things at once that are possibilities and even different. And that's true in the grammar, it's true in the words and the choices. But at the same time, there is a message. And the message of Psalms is that honesty matters. And that the power of Psalms, and what's unique about it as a literature, is that these are poems unfiltered, written to God, And because God knows you, you got to tell it straight. Coming from the deepest parts of people's neshama, their deepest yearnings. And as a result, there's something that rings real and true and touches our hearts. And that's why I think the Psalms endures as this playbook for the Jewish people. And as we begin and celebrate the gift of Torah, we do so knowing that Torah, the 5 books of Moses, is an ongoing set of revelations. We can't always pinpoint when and how Torah was written or Psalms was written. And it's our responsibility and opportunity to make the words our own and to be surprised by how they enliven us. Chag Sameach, may Torah continue to hageh yomam v'layla. May Torah continue to be a focus of uplift day and night.
I just wanted to thank you so very much. I have to apologize for our little kind of rabbinic think tank over here. As you're speaking, we said, okay, that's it. We're teaching Psalms next year. We do what's called learning circles, kind of small groups of Torah study. And we just kind of, so we're saying it out loud and we're committing ourselves, Rabbi Taft doesn't know, but we're going to commit ourselves to teach your book this upcoming year.
We did 1 in 23.
Okay. And I just wanted to say more of a comment rather than a question. You know, I've never thought of Ashrei or the idea of happiness as a pursuit of feeling shlemut, of feeling whole or complete. And in the juxtaposition of Psalm 1 and Psalm 23, I kept thinking about tonight, and this is what you spoke about so eloquently in your conclusion, that it really is the traveling, the journey on the Ma'aglei Tzedek. It's really the traveling on this journey, that the roundabouts, that sometimes you just feel like you're going in a circle, but what leads you and I thought you were saying cheesecake continues, helps you continue forward. I was gonna say it's Torah that allows us to keep on this circle of life, even when it's dark or when we feel forlorn or scared. Ki ata imadi. In our pursuit of Torah, we realize that God is with us. So thank you truly for this teaching, for allowing us to see Psalms in an entirely new way, your personal Torah and your personal perspective that allows us to receive Torah anew tonight. Thank you. Thank you, everybody. Yes, there is cheesecake, though. That's what I thought. You thought the answer was to life, was cheesecake. No.
And then if I can again add, if anybody is curious about Cuba, it's rare to have an opportunity to go, let alone to Jewish engagement with the community. Two people I'm doing this with are experienced. It's on a high level. In Cuba, you can only stay in 5-star hotels if you're an American, because you can only stay in American-owned hotels. And there's 4, they're all 5-star. So if this is of curiosity, you don't need to decide, but there are flyers and you can find out more. And again, I brought only a handful of books if anybody wants. You can take, and then later you can send the money to the synagogue and they'll send something to me, whatever you feel is appropriate. So thank you.
Thank you. A question for you. Okay, now you said you have some books tonight, but if people want to buy this Friday, Amazon's the best way of doing it?
Yeah.
Okay.
He has to buy them. So he has to buy the books. It's not like we have free books.
Okay, didn't know how it works.
He has ordered these books.
Okay. So it's better for us. Through Amazon. Okay, perfect. Okay, thank you. Oh, Rabbi Kornskold.
Yeah, I mean, no, thanks for joining us tonight. And I know there's things going on all around the city. If you're interested in continuing your learning, but also tomorrow we have services at 9 a.m. in this room. We're also celebrating the adult B'nai Mitzvah tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. And then Thursday morning, 9 a.m. is in Ziegler Sanctuary, and there is Yizkor on Thursday. And tomorrow, 5:45 for
We're publishing 10:30.
Come by 10:15 on Thursday, just.
Thursday for Yizkor.
10:30 Yizkor.
Or 9, and then you'll never be late. So, that's what I would always recommend. Chag Sameach, everybody. Thank you so much, Rabbi Spitz. And right outside this way in Hall of Builders, there is cheesecake.
In case anybody missed it, there's cheesecake.
Thank you so much. Thank you. We're sitting.